Wi-Fi green room guests?
No.
Wi-Fi is okay. So we're all set for our second session, which we are calling Better Judgment. So we're delighted to have a wonderful group of presenters to talk about more equitable, trusted ways of covering the justice system. We are led by Moderator Hinton, publisher of Scallywag. Hinton has an undying love and passion for the bag, where she oversees operations and planning. According to its mission, through journalism and storytelling, Scallywag works in solidarity with oppressed communities in the South to disrupt and shift the narratives that keep power and wealth. Our panelists are Paul Kuno Booth, freelance journalist and reporter on several alternative justice projects in New Hampshire, and Delia Jones, freelance journalist and former director of investigation at Borealis Philanthropy, which invests in leaders, organizations, and movements in the pursuit of transformational change. We had hoped to have Molly Bourne, a West Virginian documentarian and journalist, with us today, but she is tending to some pressing family medical needs. So please join me in welcoming Sierra, Paul, and Delia.
Hey y'all, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation today. Before we dive in, I would a little more of an introduction from our panelists. So Paul and Delia, and I will round us out. Can you just talk a little bit about what has brought you to this moment? Like, how did you get?
I'll start. So I was really interested in language and literature and storytelling when I was younger, and at some point just happened to take a class in kind of fell in love with the idea of using storytelling going on in the real world. I think stories have that kind of story power, and about 5 years ago, Keene Sentinel, as a local reporter, was there for about 4 years, and I'm now a Keene doing some work on police accountability stories, various other topics.
Yeah. I always say that I came to journalism by way of the Black women in my community. In East Texas, Black women are usually the oral history tellers. The history bearers in our community. So when you think about all of the history of the actual church in the community, Reverend Betty Kennedy, my auntie, who was an English teacher in Baytown in Houston, used to take me to her house so I could sit at her feet, crisscross applesauce, I remember it, and listen to her tell stories of Black history. Where I grew up, that type of history isn't emphasized in schools. A lot of revisionist history, of course, in Texas education, as y'all know. And so, that was what put me on. And so I went to college for theater originally, y'all, believe. And then just had an intro course and was like, oh, natural. And so, yeah, that's how I got into it.
Awesome. Thank y'all for sharing. And I'll just let you know up front, I'm not a reporter, not a writer. I'm a publisher, and I let folks know that I became a publisher on accident. Career and background is in nonprofit fundraising. And I joined the team at Scallywag in 2017 because I believed in the mission of the work. And yeah, I really loved what they were trying to do. And Scallywag is a nonprofit organization. They needed to raise money, and I was like, yeah, I know how to raise money. And it was back when Scallowag, and you can, probably imagine how that went. Did not go model that was able to sustain itself. And it's hard. And leading the turnaround of a startup, which is just a very interesting story all by itself, that we can get into another time. But that is what brought me into the journalism industry, and is now a big part of my work. So in addition to working at Scallowag, I'm also a coach, and have had the great privilege to work with a lot of folks in this room around reader revenue, and I have a really big passion for reader revenue, not only for the pathways that I think it creates for news organizations, for their sustainability, but also for the connections that I think that it creates between newsrooms and their communities. So thank you all again for sharing more about who you are and what brings you to this room. And so as we've already glimpsed today with the panel right before this, journalists often cover policing in a way that reinforces state power, sometimes harms people and communities, and can even thwart justice. And so today we're going to explore some of the ways that journalists are actually shifting their practices to provide equitable and even reparative reporting. So we're going to start with you, Paul. And Paul is going to talk to us about how to be more intentional about covering cops, courts, policing, and as an individual journalist, and also what it looks like to structure your crime beat and guide your coverage as a newsroom leader, and also, what that looked like for one newsroom to work through that. So, Paul, whenever you're ready, jump in.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so as I said, my name's Paul. I previously worked at the Keene Sentinel as a reporter and editor. Just so everyone knows, I'm currently a freelancer, not employed by them, not speaking on their behalf in any way, but just sort of relaying my own experience from working there. So during that time, I was the primary cops and courts reporter, which is what journalists call the beat. That's, writing up arrests, writing about police, writing about court cases. And over the time I worked there and continuing since, the paper has made a lot of changes to how it covers those. So I want to just, as Sierra was saying, talk about what that looked like in one newsroom, not because I think we have all the answers. It's still very much a work in progress, but hopefully it can be a little bit instructive. Hang on a sec. Not sure why the slides aren't going. Sorry. Is there anyone who can help me figure this out? Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So yeah, when I joined the Keene Sentinel in 2017, this was really what the crime beat looked like, right? It was a lot of these kind of quick hit articles, getting press releases from the police, writing that up, going to the courthouse to grab the latest cases, just typing up like lists of who was indicted in the county that month. Really not a lot of reporting, not a lot of context, just kind of these quick hit articles based on police accounts. And I think that's what crime coverage looks like for a lot of small papers, a lot of TV stations. But sort of the more I was doing this kind of work, I started to feel like just some qualms about it, feeling like it was really missing a lot, and also not fair to the people who were involved in it. So I want to talk about one story I still remember covering. This was from 2018, early in my time at the Sentinel. We get this news release from a small town near here, and basically, it says that this woman had allegedly driven onto a frozen pond, which is a thing you can drive onto in New Hampshire, run over some ice fishing equipment, was driving donuts on the ice, and then led police on a low-speed chase, throwing things out the window. And so it's one of these, right? You get the release, and it's like, okay, this has all this detail. It's like really weird. It's the sort of thing that's like catnip to a local paper. So we wrote it up, moved on with our day. And then a couple of years later, I remember seeing an obituary for a name that seemed familiar. I Googled it, realized it was this person from this incident. And it turns out that at the time that whole strange circumstance happened, she had recently had brain surgery. She was dealing with some undiagnosed PTSD, was just going through this really difficult time in her life. And that had sort of been the context for that. None of that, of course, was in the original story, the original release. And so there was that context missing that really changed the narrative of it. And I think the more I was doing this work, the more I was realizing that's actually kind of under a lot of these stories, right? There are people dealing with histories of trauma, substance use, poverty, or just, having a bad day, whatever it is. There are these larger circumstances that we never talk about when we just focus on what the police say happened and whether someone allegedly broke a law or not. And that kind of coverage, right, it's deeply stigmatizing. It impacts people because you're putting their name out there. It's on the internet forever. 5 or 10 years, employers, landlords are going to find that and maybe deny them housing or work. So we began to have some conversations in the newsroom, and this was a really gradual process. Over several years, we were, having these conversations around, okay, well, we're writing up every time someone's arrested for drug possession, because that's technically a felony in New Hampshire for some reason. But there's this increasing recognition that, drug addiction is an illness. We're trying to decrease the stigma, but we're still writing up, articles about people arrested for it. So that was one where we had a conversation internally and said, okay, we can stop doing this kind of case. Same thing happened with, like petty property crimes, misdemeanor level stuff. So sort of over time, we were starting to say, we don't need to do as much of this, just kind of listing everyone who's arrested, putting all their names out there for things that really are fairly minor in the scheme of things. And then it sort of gradually evolved into a more formal conversation where we were really trying to look systematically at what we were doing and say, what do we actually want out of the crime beat? So we did a reader survey to ask folks, what do you look for in public safety coverage? What would be helpful for you? What's not helpful? Got a range of responses, as you can imagine. Some people really didn't want us to stop doing, covering the sort of random theft that happened on their street that day. Some people said, I don't need any of that, just focus on systemic issues. We also worked with someone from Poynter Institute who's really thought a lot about this, Kelly McBride, to help us have those conversations. And that's sort of around the time I left the Sentinel, but I did talk to my former editor recently about some of the changes they've continued to make. So I can't claim credit for these, but I think the biggest thing is just covering way fewer individual arrests and really shifting from a presumption of, if we get news of an arrest, if we see it in court, we're going to cover it, shifting, kind of flipping that and really saying, we're actually going to make the presumption that we don't cover arrests unless there's a really good reason to, right? If it's a very serious charge, if it's something that played out in public, maybe it involves a prominent person or public official, okay, maybe there's a public interest to learning about that, but not if it's just by default. And that has also come with sort of a commitment, a deeper commitment to covering cases through to the end, right? So, when I was speaking to my editor, she was saying, what we're doing now is saying, if we cover an arrest, we're going to see that case all the way through court. A lot of times, charges are dropped or reduced, so it's kind of about fairness. But the other impact that has had is sparking more conversations about, well, what do we really have the resources to cover? If we start covering this case and commit to covering it all the way through sentencing, is that a good use of our time? Actually, maybe not. It's not that serious. And that frees up reporting resources for sort of more useful coverage. There's also been this is still underway, but working on publishing policy, right? So someone comes to us or comes to the Sentinel, I keep saying us, but comes to the Sentinel and says, hey, 5 years ago, you wrote this thing about my arrest. I've moved on, but now every time I apply for a job, this comes up, whatever. So crafting policies around what situations can we actually, take that down, or when do we think it's reasonable to leave it up? And there were some, questions about, well, do we really want to be deleting coverage? Do we want to be taking things out of the public record? But sort of where my editor said they're striking the balance is, de-indexing things from Google, right? So they don't show up anymore. And that seems to be pretty much what people are looking for. Really limiting the use of mugshots, again, just really in exceptional circumstances. I think that's an easy one. It's, those are very stigmatizing images. And then I think just kind of at a larger level, really trying to be more intentional, structuring the beat. When I started at the Keene Sentinel and was given the crime beat, I didn't have a lot of experience in that area, and there was no sort of guiding vision for what that coverage should do. It was sort of like, all right, you're going to go to the courthouse every week, get the schedule, see what's on the docket. You're going to get the list of new charges from the court and write those up, but no kind of larger sense of like, what is that meant to accomplish? What do readers get out of it? So the Sentinel's also been working on, crafting more of a mission statement with some guiding principles for saying, okay, our public safety coverage is going to involve, accountability for public safety systems. It's going to give people information to help keep themselves safe. It's going to explore, factors that influence crime and solutions to try and address that. So then when you have those principles in place, you can really, and something, some news release comes onto your desk, you can look at it and say, well, does this match up with those principles? Does, this serve one of those interests? And if it doesn't, you can sort of let it go. So I think it's still very much a work in progress. There are definitely some challenges that I could talk more about, but I don't want to take too much time. But yeah, I think overall just, I think there's a lot of value in just starting to ask those questions, looking at, okay, we've been publishing a daily police log for years with everyone's name in it for often very minor stuff, 18-year-olds possessing alcohol even. Is that serving the public, or could we get them that information in other ways? Could we do a weekly roundup of this is how many noise complaints police responded to, this is how many property crimes, without having to say, here's the person's name and age, and have that live online forever. So again, I think just starting to ask those questions of some of these kind of entrenched practices is really valuable. And then again, having that sort of vision or expectation for what this coverage is trying to achieve.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate everything that you just shared, but especially the ability to reflect on the practices and ask, like, what is it that we are doing that is enabling the harm in the communities, or the harm that individual people within our communities are experiencing? What is our role in this, and like what's within our control to shift? And I think another piece that goes along with that is around like, okay, and like we've been doing this for a while, right? Like these are practices that are not just something that's happening here. This is something that we know that is happening across the industry. And like, what does repair look like? What does it look like to also be accountable for the fact that this has been going on? And so with that, I want to turn to you, Dalia, to talk about reparative journalism practices and the work that you've been doing in East Texas in a community that has faced not only harm by police, but terror. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Cool. And are we able to get it up? Up, there you go. All right, thank you. And I want to see if it'll actually work. Yep. Okay, cool. Yeah. Thank you, Sierra. So I just kind of want to start out with saying ETX made all day, every day. East mode, beast mode. I'm always rep Deep East Texas, no matter where I go. And so to start out, I want to give you a little bit of history of Deep East Texas. I just did it.
It's like a thing.
Is
like
it
was
the
not a thing.
down arrow?
Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. So I always let people know that I'm 7th generation East Texan, technically 8th. So I go back between 7 to 8, depending on what side of my family I'm talking about. And I first want to dedicate this presentation to Jessie Lee Baker, my great grandma. I actually got the news yesterday in between flights that she passed away at 102 years old. And so I'm holding that in this space right now as I'm talking about my family legacy and just talking at a rural conference. It's a reminder of why I do this work in the first place, and especially just a lot of the Black women in my family as well. So East Texas, it was the part of the state that held the most slaves historically in Texas. So 30% of the population by like 1860, 1865 was Black. And most of them were enslaved in eastern portion of Texas on the plantations there. The reason I want to start with history here, because when we talk about policing, we also have to think about the roots of policing in chattel slavery as well. This portion of the state saw the most violence in the state as far as towards Black chattel, and even during Reconstruction as well. The most lynchings ever reported in this portion of the state, when we think about spectacle lynchings, they started in Paris, Texas, which is East Texas as well. And so when I talk about East Texas, I'm not only talking about a legacy of just tradition, rootedness, and the beauty of East Texas. I'm also talking about a portion of the state that symbolizes what it means to be terrorized as a community historically as well. I could go through like a whole slew of history from like chattel slavery to Black codes to sharecropping, all the way to Jim Crow to welfare. And how policing and how the carceral state has affected those things as well. I could talk about the mass removals of communities in these areas as well. Yeah, there's just a lot. I've even talked about how, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Jasper Dragons, for example. It was I think it was Obama who created the anti-hate crime bill based off of that case. But I talk about how my dad was best friends with his son, and what that meant for our community as well, to be under the shadow of that. And so this is kind of why I think about my approach, or this is what has influenced my approach to journalism, is knowing that history and that legacy, and also understanding that on top of dismantling a lot of these issues, there also has to be a space for repair. There also has to be a space for healing, whether that be on an interpersonal level or a more systems level basis. And so that brings me to Collab. So I kind of want to read the purpose statement before I go into it. The purpose of this project was to take a rehabilitative approach toward this history of oppression. We wanted to develop a replicable model the Texas Observer and other outlets across the state could use as a foundation for coverage of historically overlooked communities, especially in rural areas of the state. We also wanted to empower exploited residents and grassroots leaders by putting the tools of journalism into their hands while we gained insight into coverage needs. It took me moving away from home and realizing all of the issues that were at home. Yeah, it took me moving away from the shadow of East Texas to realize that a lot of stuff wasn't right. And I want to say that this framework for this project is informed by Black Southern liberation tradition, by the Out of Struggle Strengthening and Expanding Movement Journalism in the U.S. South from Project South, which is a grassroots organization, the work of Press On, Free Press, the Listening Collective, and the Southern Movement Assembly as well. Whenever we're thinking about our approaches to communities, the first people that we should be looking towards are organizers, are folks who are on the ground actually engaging and actually working to actually repair our communities. I don't come into movement work because I was a movement person. I come to it by way of journalism. It was through the Freedom Ways Fellowship, through Press On. I knew graduating from a traditional J school, I was like, something is not right about this coverage. Because I was like, the same people who are protesting, like, I want to be right there with my fist balled up next to them, right? And then also having objectivity hammered into my mind on a constant basis and knowing that it just didn't sit right with me. And so that was just to give you a little context as to where this project came out of. So for this, we did several approaches. Me and my colleague, Zakaria Washington, built a 9-step a la carte model to essentially approaching communities in different parts of the state. So we worked with indigenous communities across the state. We worked along the border in the RGV region. We worked in Central Texas in a rural area, as well as Deep East Texas. In Nacogdoches specifically, which is the oldest town in Texas, and the town I grew up next to the town, basically. So first what we did is we established community selection. So we basically reached out to all of the, I hate calling people stakeholders, but people in the community who have influence, right? Folks who are respected in the community and who are also leading the community. A second part of that was the initial outreach and the research and listening sessions. So instead of just like going in and asking people, what do you think should be covered? We're actually doing our due diligence of learning about the community outside of our capacities as journalists as well. So actually sitting in rooms with folks, churches, community events, talking to folks. The third step was to identify and define specific community needs and basically to choose their own adventure. So once we kind of assessed with community leaders what was the best approach to actually reporting in these communities, we were like, so I'm kind of talking fast, but basically the point of this model was to kind of gauge feedback from the community about how the community wanted to actually be reported on. And to also understand what are the resources that we can put in play while we're also doing that reporting. So how can we actually leave more than we're actually taking from the community? And so we did media trainings. So we pulled back the curtains on what media or what journalism is. What is the process? How do you come up with editorial decisions? Historically, what has the media done wrong to your community? And historically, how have you been represented within newsrooms, whether that be like a Ida B. Wells or any other person that isn't necessarily raised up as well in journalism. We also look towards town halls. So in Nacogdoches, specifically, the Deep East Texas is hit hard a lot by natural disasters. And so for the first time in like the city's history or the town's history, we actually had like officials on a panel with like local leaders, local church leaders, grassroots folks. And then also went specifically to the lower income neighborhoods within that area and passed out pamphlets and flyers and said, come to this meeting. It was the first time that officials had actually been held accountable publicly and in person by some of the local residents as well. We also did event of choice. So if folks wanted to do a fish fry, they could. If folks wanted to do like a vigil, for example, they could. And we still collected feedback that way. Survey events, and so especially during COVID, innovating with the grassroots leaders on the grounds and what those survey events look like as well. And then event feedback also kind of informed our process as well. And then we kind of went to the drawing board and was like, how engaged is the community actually? And is this community really ready for like the survey event first without the media training, town hall, and event of choice? Can we go straight to that survey event? or do we kind of need to kind of peel the layers off before folks actually engage with this? And so if you read the full, it's a 48-page report, y'all. If you read the full report, I feel like I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but if you read it, you'll understand why our approach was the way that it was. Step 5, survey event. So if we already didn't do that in the previous step, then of course that was the next thing. We worked with social workers from the local HBCU. So Texas Observer was actually based in Austin, and there's the local HBCU. We work with folks who were from the backgrounds of a lot of the communities so that they could help us not only determine like what the numbers were telling us around like what media needs were, but also the socioeconomic issues that were also happening around that. We also reviewed data and passed those results to editorial, who would then take that and then use that to inform their actual reporting. And then kind of after the reporting was done, did an editorial review, and then we kind of assessed the progress, next steps, all those things. I also want to reiterate too is the issue with engagement right now, and I think this is journalism overall, is capacity, funding, and then also the reality that engagement takes more than a year. So we got this grant from the Google News Initiative, hoping that we would actually secure funding to continue the work as well. When we talk about engagement, we don't talk about the barriers from like COVID-19 actually extending the timeline of engagement. We don't talk about how the organization's values also inform how you engage too, and so do they align with the reparative approach that you're putting into play, which is something that we also ran into. And then so many other factors as well. And while we were also collecting our engagement feedback and kind of thinking about this reparative model approach where we're leaving more than we're actually taking, we looked at different ways to actually share out information to the community. So one of the community members mentioned, she was like, we really like magnets. So during the disaster planning feedback session, or the actual like town hall that we did, we actually passed out magnets that had resources for disaster, for issues in the community. So in Nacogdoches, for example, after a hurricane hit the area, half of the town, especially the lower income Black side of the town, were without water and without power. During the actual freeze that hit Texas as well, you saw more deaths in those areas too. Also, you saw basically just a total denial of the inequalities that were happening by like the local officials, which is not a surprise. On top of our media trainings, we also passed out community journalism pamphlets with those tips to the community too. And honestly, y'all, we did so many different ways of sharing information with folks, but we really depended on the folks, like the grassroots leaders on the ground, to share out that information, because that's where trust is going to start with the community first, with the folks who are doing the movement work. And then also we were equipping them to protect themselves from us, if that makes sense. So me being part of that, like I'm from the area, so I feel like I'm a little bit more sensitive to a lot of the issues going there. But the framework itself is set up so that you put barriers and blockades in the way, and also informs you of like the sensitive ways you need to be approaching communities in the first place too. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Yeah. So basically the results of this work were based on like trust building and centering people and their lived experience. And traditional journalism, of course, can get in the way of that. And when we're talking about coverage of police, anytime that we're talking about anything related to the carceral system, we also have to really be thinking of ways that we're pouring in instead of extracting as well. So.
Thanks, Aaliyah. Yeah, I think where you just ended really resonates with what Paul was saying, or what I heard and what Paul was saying, just around like a recognition of people's humanity. Mm-hmm. Paul, when you were mentioning like the context that was missing in the story about the woman on the lake was where she was in that period in her life. That's what it is, right? It's like when we are just putting out a story about this one moment in this person's life, it's missing all of the context, all the moments that came before and all the moments that are going to come after. And then they're just sort of frozen in time in our newspaper in our online publication, and then for folks to find, and that's what they're judged based off of that interaction with cops, with courts, with the carceral state, and with the system. So thank you so much for talking about your work in East Texas, talking about repair, and talking about, I think, the very important role of community engagement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we do at Scalawag.
Amazing work, by the way.
Thank you. Which I think for us, we don't do daily reporting. A lot of our work focuses on systems. And I think because of that, we have an opportunity to look at this from sort of a different lens. And so that's the bulk of what I'm going to talk to you all about today. And so at Scalawag, we are an abolitionist media organization. And I think when we say the word abolition, folks are like, especially because of the narrative around abolition right now. And so with that, I sort of invite folks to, I think, think about something that Dalia has already brought up, which is like, abolition is something that we have already done and been doing. Like, we abolished slavery. That is a thing that happened. And so abolition is not a new concept for us, right? There have been other systems that we have abolished because we have come to understand the harm that they were doing. So I think that's one. And two, I think something else that we hear a lot of around abolition is that, like, oh, well, we're trying to destroy this system, right? Or we're trying to dismantle the system or disrupt the system or what have you. But the reason that I'm an abolitionist is because of the thing that we get to reimagine instead. And that thing being liberation and freedom, true freedom for all of us. And I think the thing that is really difficult right now is because of the way that the system is currently, it actually makes it really hard to imagine something beyond this. And so that's a lot of what we talk about in our work at Scalawag, particularly in our work around policing and the carceral system. And so I'm actually going to start off by reading an excerpt written by Scalawag's Race and Place editor, Co Bragg, from the launch of Pop Justice, which is our new reporting series, which examines the way that pop culture in particular warps our understanding of policing justice and ultimately thwarts abolition. Think about how many cops there are in our media. It's not just the First 48 or the true crime canon. Friendly cops surface even when we don't pay them any mind. Woody from Toy Story, a whole sheriff. The beloved Winston of New Girl, an embarrassingly awful rookie cop. Will Smith and Martin Lawrence play detectives fighting the drug war in the first film of the Bad Boys franchise. Family Matters was a multi-generational cop show. Carl Winslow moved up the ranks of the Chicago Police Department to become a captain, and his son Eddie joined the force in season 9. Can you recall an abolitionist or grassroots organizer with even an iota of that prevalence? Or a police or true crime show that didn't paint arrest, imprisonment as a satisfying arc? No cop shows reflect the reality of what actually happens when you call police, if they bother to come to your neighborhood at all. But all cop shows shape our misunderstanding of policing. The bumbling donut-eating cop, the detectives who solve all the rape cases, the true crime, fear-mongering marathons of Snap that have you rooting for the cops and side-eyeing your neighbors. These tropes paint the system as either unassuming and innocent or effective and necessary. It's no wonder that so many of us default to upholding this violent institution built on a legacy of doing more harm than protection. And sure, it's easy to dismiss TV as low-quality media, but numbers don't lie. 96% of all households in the country watch it. By comparison, print and digital newspapers circulate to 24.3 million people, or just about 7% of the U.S. population. For decades, we've binge-watched series about special police forces solving especially heinous crimes and Law and Order and all its spinoffs. If/when we call 911, many of us have to remind ourselves that the moments that follow often will not turn out like what we see on TV. This act alone can cost us our lives. In reality, our system convicts people for less than 2% of crimes. Put another way, compared with the likelihood for a cop to make an arrest that sends someone to prison, police officers are more likely to be charged or convicted with domestic violence or shoot a Black person in cold blood. It's harder to parse when we've seen police put away the bad boys to the tune of oversaturated reggae music. It's even harder for most folks to imagine what justice outside the criminal legal system even looks like. So in pop justice, I think we have been doing for the last 3 years what we call Abolition Week, and it was born out of the work that we have been doing since 2016 with incarcerated writers. So we have been working with folks who are currently incarcerated and publishing their work. And 3 years ago, we started doing Abolition Week, which is a week where we only publish work by folks who are currently incarcerated. And then last year we expanded that to start working with systems impacted people, because we recognize that there are family members, folks who are on the outside who also have a perspective to share about what it's like to be in relationship with folks, with someone who is on the inside, right? And so in doing that work, we're publishing what we feel like is really great content. Folks are engaging with it, but they're not really engaging with it in a way that we had hoped that they would. And I think our learning in that was just sort of the inaccessibility of abolition, and just the ways that it can really be hard to, again, even like imagine what that looks like, because of all of the content that folks are getting about policing, about the carceral state, about cops, and like what we understand like cops to be and crime to be, and who is a criminal and who's not a criminal, and who's innocent and who is guilty. And so pop justice is really our answer to that, to be able to look at policing in a new way, to be able to examine that and understand that from a new perspective. In hopes that we can then start to help folks shift and imagine something different in its place. And I think that, what we have, I think what this like points to even beyond that is like the media's role in all of that. And like this pop justice talks a lot about, popular media that's not just journalism, but obviously, as we've talked about on this panel, as we heard on the last panel, we also play a role in that. And, I think as a Southerner in particular, I think about ideology a lot. And I think about how media functions as a part of like the state, and how it reinforces ideology as a part of the state, and how we are then reinforcing what folks think about as like the things that I named around like what police do, what communities are good, what communities are bad, et cetera. And so what does it look like to then do something different? And how do we shift our practices to allow for folks to do an imagining of and a shift in ideology? And I think that's especially important. And the reason that I brought up the South is because, I think what we've seen in the South, and this gets a little bit away from policing, but I think it demonstrates this very well, is, in 2016, around the election, when folks were talking about Trump voters, they talked about Trump voters as Southerners. They talked about them as undereducated. They talked about them as poor. They talked about them as being from rural communities. They talked about them as being everything other than white. And that was something that journalists did. That was a narrative that journalists upheld, right? And, you know, I think with that, what that really like reinforces are like the narratives that uphold systems of power. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about cops, courts, policing. You know, what are the systems of power that we are upholding as journalists through the narratives that we are telling? And then how do we dismantle those systems of power by telling different stories? So that is a lot of the work that we do at Scalawag. That is a lot of the thinking that we do. And you know, talking about specifically just journalistic praxis and what does that look like. You know, Dalia already talked about reparative. Just journalistic praxis is reparative. You know, we have to acknowledge the harm that we've already done and seek to understand how we, what we do about that. I think it also, just journalistic praxis also centers care. You know, Dalia mentioned objectivity. Objectivity requires that we create distance between us and the people that are in our community, the people that we are reporting about. But when we are operating with care, that requires intimacy. It requires that we know the people that we're reporting about because they're in our community, they're our neighbors, they're our friends, you know. So that's another thing that like requires a shift in the way that we practice journalism. Just journalistic practice is also democratized. I think in what Dalia shared, and I know in what a lot of other folks are doing, is figuring out how we move from journalism as a thing that a few people know how to do to actually treating journalism as the practice that it is, and how do we make it so that more people can be practicing journalism, and so that we can share that act with others, and again, the democratization of that act. So that is just when we think about how we can start to shift the relationship between journalism and the practice of how we are upholding the harm that has happened, particularly around coverage of cops in court. It is that just journalistic praxis. It is reparative. It does center care, and it is also democratized. So, thank you. So I have some questions for you all, but before I dive into those, is there any thoughts that you all want to share? Anything that you want to add?
Yeah. I think when we think about a lot of this work, as journalists, we always, again, talk about things from a distance without realizing that there has to be interpersonal work done, too, on the personal level in order to extend that work out to the journalism, too. And so when we're talking about reparations, when we're talking about what reparative is, the act of doing in itself is practicing. It doesn't have to be perfect for you to practice it. You are going to get it wrong, and that is okay. In what ways can you repair that harm, right? Or continue to learn your way through it as well. And so just being very thoughtful, of course, like not just going in all willy-nilly and doing whatever you want, because that ain't a good idea. But also just being very thoughtful and intentional about the work that you're doing. I think that journalism in itself is an industry that is actually built against thoughtfulness, the grind of journalism. And so, I don't know, just kind of reminding folks who are within the field to really just be mindful of the ways in which we are entering into a space, especially a space in which we are not from. And how are you empowering people instead of taking the narrative or the platforms from them as well. So.
Yeah, and Sierra, as you were talking about this question of, are we just tearing systems down or trying to reimagine what comes in its place? I was thinking about that again when it comes to this sort of journalism, and I've spent a lot of the last few years thinking about how do we do less of this, just do less harm, but imagining what's a better form, what replaces it. I think that's a bit harder work and still something I'm trying to grapple with, and I know a lot of my former colleagues at the Sentinel are grappling with, and definitely second the idea that the grind of journalism is a problem here. I think a really underrated factor when it comes to this kind of problematic crime coverage is just how easy those stories are to get, right? Police send you a news release in your inbox. You don't really need to do any further reporting. You should, but you don't have to in a lot of places, or you can just go to the courthouse and look up the latest cases. Again, it's there's enough there in the documents that you can put together a story, and when you're in a situation where you're understaffed, you need at least one story or more every day. It's just kind of a recipe for thoughtlessness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I want to, I think that's a really great point that you brought up because, and thank you, because I think that is the distinction that I should have made clearer. As someone who thinks about things on a systems level, I think that there are folks who need to be doing that work, who are like, oh yeah, let's be up here thinking about systems and imagining what we do moving forward. And we need folks who are like, yeah, there's harm happening right now. Mm-hmm. What are we going to do to mitigate the harm that's happening currently? Yep. What are we going to do to shift the material conditions? And so, like, I'm super grateful for anyone who is thinking about, okay, there are things that we can, practical things that we can do to rethink and reshape how we are engaging communities in this moment as we think about what it looks like to do this differently long term. Mm-hmm. Great. So with that, I'm gonna I have a couple of questions, and then we will absolutely open it up. My first question is, policing is a very divisive issue, which I believe makes it difficult for some journalists to do the type of reporting and engagement work that y'all have talked about today. So for journalists that are concerned about maybe like alienating audiences, what practical advice or suggestions do you have for making the shift to more just, equitable reporting, especially around the criminal justice system?
So I guess my question is like, what audience are you serving? So if we're talking about upholding democracy and the values of which this country is founded on, which I have my personal feelings about, I think a part of that is also understanding, are we trying to serve audiences that are already covered, for one, but already hold some type of power within the community, or some type of say-so. So yeah, that's like my first thing. I'm just reeling in my head right now, y'all, of all the editors who are like, oh, I don't know, our audience wouldn't like that, or you know what I mean? And so I'm just trauma from the newsroom. I'm in philanthropy now. I just needed a break, but still, yeah.
I guess what I'd say is just, especially for those of us in local or state journalism, the more you can bring it down to the closest level possible. I think this echoes a theme from the earlier panel, where just kind of invoking a national debate might not get you anywhere, but if you can actually get real data on, are police stopping Black people disproportionately on I-95 in New Hampshire, and you can show it through data, this place that you drive, this thing that you've heard about elsewhere is happening here. I think that sort of thing can be productive, or hearing from voices of people in New Hampshire about their experiences with police. So again, I think the more concrete you can make it, the more you can bring it down to the local and state level. and explore specifically how it's playing out here as opposed to sort of this more abstracted debate. I think that helps. And then I think just one other thing that we talked about while we were doing some of this work at the Sentinel is, trying to frame it not just as we're doing less, but we're doing something different, right? If we're doing less of these kind of like one-off arrest stories, we're going to try and do more, substantive coverage of like trends, right? So it's not, hey, this one person got arrested for shoplifting, but how big of an issue is, retail theft in the community? So trying to frame it as like, we're giving you actual more and better information. Those are the two things that come to mind for me.
I kind of want to piggyback off of that, and then also just a reminder to humanize the data too. I think so many times, especially with reporters, we just like to regurgitate numbers, and not almost like in most cases, especially for like bigger mainstream investigative units, especially in Texas, if we're talking about that place, is it like who are you actually trying to communicate that information to, and then what is the best form to communicate that information to? I'm talking about this as somebody who my family does not read my work or like my investigative work because they don't really read long form stories. But if I did I used to work for NPR. So if I did like a podcast or if I did an audio story, then I would be able to actually convey that information to them a little bit better. And then also through a more narrative form, especially coming from an oral storytelling community too. So.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. I think as a cops reporter, it's really easy to get lost in like the documents and kind of have this dry, here's what police say happened and was it appropriate by their own standards, and you lose that. How does this impact real live people? So yeah, thanks for that.
And then my second question for you all is, beyond reporting on policing, how else have you seen local newsrooms or journalists produce equitable reporting, practice journalism in a reparative way, or otherwise show care for communities and people?
Documented is a great example. They're in New York, and so they cover a lot of the immigrant communities in the area and are very intentional about hiring reporters who are also of backgrounds or like from those communities too. But the ways in which they use SMS text messaging to actually put out like newsletters, surveys, or information, or like handing out flyers on the ground, right? And actually meeting people where they are. Even the ways in which they source for stories and story ideas is really interesting. And I know that Mazen, who's one of the folks who founded Documented too, has been helping folks think about different frameworks and even using the approach that they use in New York in other areas too. So I think that that's a great example.
So one thing that comes to mind just here in New Hampshire, so New Hampshire Public Radio, which full disclosure, I'm doing some work for, but they have several Spanish language journalists on staff and are really making an investment in doing Spanish language news and covering those communities. New Hampshire has a small but growing Latino population, especially in kind of the Nashua area. So I think that's just another way of saying, okay, by the whole state, this might not be a huge portion of the population, but it's a very important community. And again, it's growing and we want to make sure we're serving it.
Great, thank you. Okay, now we can open it up to questions from the audience.
I'll try to ask the first one.
Okay, great.
This is all very, very interesting, compelling conversation and obviously thought-provoking. I'm wondering, as you consider the work that you're doing, and how might you measure the impact of that work? And what sort of feedback are you receiving that tells you, yeah, this is the direction we need to be going in?
That's a good question. You want to go first?
I'll try. That's a great question, Terry. I don't think I've given enough thought to really think about it. I guess I don't have a great systemic answer. I think as a journalist, the feedback I value most is when someone reaches out and said, "Hey, thanks for that story. It made me, think about an issue or think about people differently." I remember doing a story about a drug court and interviewing some people who had really serious, drug addiction and kind of related criminal behavior connected to that. and we're in recovery and doing well, and we're describing their experiences, and just getting, one email from one reader saying, this made me think differently about when I see, Keene police post, hey, we arrested some drug dealers. I'm not going to think about that the same anymore. Like, that to me, if one person thinks that way, like, that to me is a great impact. As for broader impact, I don't have a great answer, but thanks.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this question in two ways, on like a personal level and then also like on a project level. So for the community engagement framework that we have, a part of it is actually going back to the leaders to assess the process, or how they felt about the process, as well as any feedback that they could offer us as well, to actually tweak the ways in which we actually engage with communities. And then on the personal level, I go back home all the time. My dad is actually formerly incarcerated, and so we talk about abolition way more, and just issues with being from a community that has some of the highest risk rates of Black men and women in the state as well. And so we are trying to actually start like an abolitionist book club out in Nacogdoches right now, where we're just kind of like recruiting people on the ground we know who are related in some type of way to the carceral system as well. And so hearing my dad go up to like his neighbor or like the person that he coaches with and being like, yeah, do you remember that project that they did where they, and I'm about to cuss, so where they got into so-and-so's ass? Yeah, so that's my daughter right there. Oh yeah, we remember that. Yeah, we coming to the event. Yeah, we're coming, right? So like hearing folks, hearing that there's already a sense of trust built, hearing like those like very, I don't know, like just feedback from people who I didn't even know knew about the project. I think that in itself is part of the community feedback too, that really matters. So.
I think on a systems level, it's like, for when I think about impact, it's like narrative change. Mm-hmm. Like, are folks talking about this in new ways? Particularly, is the popular narrative around this changing? Mm-hmm. Consciousness raising, are folks thinking about this in new ways, engaging with this in new ways? Is there a new awareness that wasn't there before? And then two, are folks more deeply engaging with this in their community? So social action for social change. So those are the three big indicators of impact. Other questions?
Yeah, how you doing today? I think you can probably hear me from down there.
Yeah.
I'm the editor of a couple of local newspapers, and something I like to do each month is called the Public Safety Profile. Where I'll try to profile an officer, try to, learn about them, learn about their circumstances. The hope of that is to familiarize them with the community in case there's an emergency. Maybe somebody's more familiar with them. Another point is to try to get more people to join that profession for the right reasons. I have a question, does that support that idea of, supporting a narrative that upholds a system of power? Like, I think there's two sides of the coin in this situation a little bit.
I think I have more questions than answers. I think my first question is like, are you providing a space to platform members of your community in the same way? And the reason I ask that question is because, police are already a part of an institution that holds power, and most individuals in a community don't have that same access to power. And so as someone who has a platform, what would it look like for you to be able to provide access to your platform, to give them access to a level of power that they otherwise wouldn't have? That's a lot of how I think about our work at Scalawag. It's like, we have a platform, like we have followers, we got our email list, we got our Twitter, whatever, and most people don't have that, right? And so we have an opportunity to allow folks to reach people in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. So, I'm sure that police officer, there's another way that they could probably reach those people and be able to introduce themselves in that same way if they really wanted to, without you being the one who's providing that opportunity.
Yes.
So
That's not your job. Is my take on
Yeah,
that.
well, I wouldn't even go that far, because
Yeah.
I think that's a decision for you to make.
Yeah.
But it's the question of, like, if as journalists, we're the voice of the people.
Yeah.
We're here to uphold democracy, which democracy is about people power. Why are we platforming folks who are part of the state?
I would say to get both sides of the situation. You know, I cover far more protests and activists than I do covering police profiles. You know, I want to get both sides of the story. I think that's a critical part of being in a news position, to understand both sides, not to necessarily always, you know, just fight fire with fire. I want to know both sides of the situation. I want to know why the police officers might feel a certain way. I want to know maybe they feel underpaid, maybe they feel they don't have the resources, maybe they're not getting the training. I want to know both sides of the situation so that I can then adequately and fairly report on it.
It sounds like my initial thought too around that is like, that sounds like an objectivity question too, because I feel like objectivity it goes in line with that both sides ism. So I think kind of to reiterate kind of what Sierra said is also understanding how power works is, I think, essential. And understanding that just because you give people the same amount of coverage, or, you know what I mean, doesn't necessarily mean that it's like equitable as well. Yeah, that's just my initial thought.
And I would add that, you know, I think, you know, I think that sort of thing could really be an opportunity maybe to really probe, like, genuinely how do the police officers in our community think about things? Why do they respond to things the way they do? I think that can enhance public understanding if it's done in certain ways and sort of connected to larger issues. You know, a story I'd love to do sometime around here is, you know, just thinking about, you know, calls for more alternatives to police responses and what that looks like in these small towns where you have, you know, maybe 5 police officers and 3 of them are part-time, and there's like no resources to, you know, stand up anything else. And so, yeah, what does it feel like to that officer to be told, you know, we don't think you should be, you know, responding to every 911 call, but also there's nothing else. And so I think that's an interesting question. For me, it's really just more about, you know, using it as an opportunity to grapple with some of those issues and think about the systems and less about sort of just kind of, you know, profiling or sort of getting their message out for them. That would be kind of my initial reaction.
Yeah. I was also going to say, this reminds me, so I work at the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund at Borealis Philanthropy, which is a social justice-based philanthropy group. And we have a new team. And so one of the things that we considered as we were renewing grants and then bringing in new grantees is we wanted to update our values with a no harm statement. And so understanding the harms in which policing and all of that has done historically to BIPOC communities, and understanding the power differences in that. And then also understanding that we don't necessarily want to be granting or kind of upholding a lot of issues with the media. So one question that has come to, like, one example is like, you know, if you're a media organization that has paired with the local police department to do like a scholarship fund. Yes, scholarships are great for kids and it's great for the community, but what does it also mean to the disparately impacted parts of the community who may also be terrorized by the police for you to be actually partnering with the police department? And how does that actually inhibit trust? And how does that also further a lot of the harm that's been happening in that community too? So yeah, that's what I thought about whenever you asked that question.
If I could throw in one more thing, I guess the other question for that police department is, you know, how transparent are they about other things?
Yeah.
Do you have access to disciplinary files if you file a right to know request, which is a big challenge in New Hampshire? Are they transparent about data? You know, I've found in covering police, a lot are very transparent when it suits their needs. They will invite you to training that, you know, shows off how they're training officers about mental health, but then there's some incident that's getting criticism in the community, and you try and get records, and it's like it takes 8 months, or they just deny it, right? So I think that is another question. Maybe is like if they want to be trying to get out their message through the media and get to know the community in that way, and maybe that is laudable, but also how transparent are they about other things the community needs to know.
Hey, Crystal.
Hi. I was so excited. Hi, everybody. Never had a microphone before. My name's Crystal Good. I'm the founder and publisher of Black by God, the West Virginian. And first of all, I want us to do a little housekeeping, if it's okay. I'm trying to send out a tweet, and I can't remember your Twitter.
Yeah. Dalyah J, Dalyah J.
D-A-L.
Y-A-H.
Okay.
J.
Got you there.
Yeah.
And are you on Twitter?
Yeah, Paul Kuno Booth.
Okay, you might know how to spell
Very
it.
straightforward.
It's Paul, P-A-U-L.
C-U-N-O-B-O-O-T-H.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great. I'm also going to shoot out a tweet from my Black by God page. Just want to recognize that Molly Bourne, she's from West Virginia, so she's one of my homegirls, and she's not here today, but she's also been working with Cal Voss, who helps Black by God quite a bit in writing stories. And the tweet that I'm going to put out from the Black by God page is some of Cal's work along with Molly, where he's done sort of an inventory. He hasn't sort of done, he's done it, an inventory of police departments across West Virginia that post mugshots on their social media accounts. So he's kind of built this index for it. And, I'm a small publication, been around for 2 years. We do print and online, but, because I feel like Scallywag is sort of they're my big cousins, you know what I mean? They kind of let me come to their parties and, make sure I'm not dressed funny. And I really have learned, and I'm so thankful for Scallywag to be bold and say we are an abolitionist publication, because it gives me the framework, and and I'm able to design and build a publication, right, which is pretty much impossible. Sometimes I think what are you doing? You're building a publication that centers Black voices in the middle of Central Appalachia during a pandemic. You know what I mean? It's all not supposed to work, but it's working. And I'm just thankful for the abolitionist narrative, because it gives me a moment to stop and think, right? So I did an article, Cal Voss helped Black by God do an article on the police chief, the first Black police chief in Huntington, West Virginia. I was sick to publish the story, right? I felt very conflicted, right? It's a good story, people should know, but you know what I mean? He's coming from the DEA, it's all of these things that make it a Black news story that people should know and we should celebrate. But at the same time, how does this go with these abolitionist principles that I'm trying to build in Black by God, which is one, we will not print a mugshot unless it is Joe Manchin, okay? So just clear on those rules. But, but it's also the teaching, because it's very important too. One of the things with building this news product is that you can't miss something that you've never had. So as a Black newspaper in Central Appalachia, I do the print because it makes it real, makes it tactile, makes people see it. You don't know that you don't have a news product because you've never had a news product. The only news product that you've had has been these other models over here. So I try to really round up a lot of content creators and share them on our social media, and then do little deep dives into them. And one particular story that I want to share with you all is just that the local rappers have a great page, right? And so they're always hyping up and showing, who's the latest rapper. But then one day they posted MC somebody got arrested, and they put the mugshot on there, right? And I sort of got into it. I was like, yo, we don't have to do this, right? We don't have to show people's mugshots. And then it became a nice debate with, but this is news, Miss Crystal, because I'm Miss Crystal. This is news and blah, blah, blah. And I said, but the story is, right? Are you going to follow up, right? Because if you're not going to follow up, right, then MC, whatever their name was, will have this trail, right, of mugshots and hashtags, and we're not going back to say that they were acquitted, or the trial was thrown out, or the police officer didn't show up, or whatever it is. And that was a really important moment for me because, and I want all of you all to please go read Pop Justice on Scallywag, because it is the shit, okay? It is so good and so meaningful and helps me reframe and rethink, but it also gives me language and bits and pieces that I'm able to share with people that don't necessarily read the newspaper, that you have a conversation with, that you put it into a screenshot, or something to share with other people, so that one, there will start to wait a minute, family? Like all of these stories, like I've been indoctrinated into like thinking like that when the police say something, it's true, which is the first rule of Black by God. And when I bring reporters in, just because the police did a press release doesn't mean we're just gonna take that press release and run it. Like I know it's a little bit harder, you have to do more work around it, but so I think that this conversation is really important. I just wanna say one more thing because it needs to be said, kind of piggybacking from the last panel, right? Which was very good, but also, I don't care, right, about the right's opinion. They have the microphone in West Virginia and many other places, and so this idea of like, how do we care about the radically right, or how do we bring them into? I'm sitting here like, what about the 65,000 Black folks in West Virginia that are trying to survive, right, inside of this insanity, right? And the other thing with Black by God is in West Virginia, who owns the media? The politicians own the media. HD Media is owned by the top sitting Democrat, and they own 14 papers across the state, right? The State Journal, that also owns all kinds of other media, radio, television, is a sitting advisor to our governor, right? Another one is owned by, all the radio stations are owned by another politician. So to me, you know what I mean? Like trying to objectify, it's too big. It's just too big of a mountain to try to, and honestly, I just gotta say it, I just don't care. They've had the microphone. Who hasn't had the microphone is Black West Virginians, brown West Virginians, LGBTQ West Virginians, you know what I mean? This whole gamut that need the microphone more so than like, please tell me, why did you vote for Trump? Like I just wanted to get that out. And so it's a really hard line because as a small publication, you know what I mean? Like if I was running mug shots, if I was talking and trying to be sympathetic, I would certainly have a lot more support and probably a lot more funding. But Scallywag shows me that it can be done, that this is a model, and that this model is actually educating and reaching people that are often left off of like who reads the news, right? We have to build a new news audience. So my name's Crystal, I'm done speaking, thank you.
Thank you, Crystal.
You want to go first? I can piggyback.
Okay. Yeah, that's a no. You're not a downer. You're just, this is actually one of my favorite things to talk about. I think that I really think that it is a lot of what it's not rocket science. I think that a lot of folks are looking for like a silver bullet, and it's really right in front of us, and it's like journalism as civic infrastructure, or just infrastructure. So at Scalawag, we think about it as movement infrastructure, and we positioned ourselves within a social change ecosystem. But however you're thinking about whatever infrastructure you want to think about your organization as, like, it is journalism as infrastructure. And so I think when you start to think about journalism as infrastructure, there's actually many ways to pay for journalism. I think that there are, beyond a subscription model, many access points for community support of journalism. So there's donations, there's membership models. You can have all three. You can have two of those three. There's also foundation support, and I'll let Dalia talk about philanthropy, but more and more we're also seeing even for-profit news organizations be able to access support from foundations. And I think that the way to actually be able to do that is to say, like, we are providing a service to our community. That comes from being, like, actually engaging your community, which I think is something that we weren't really seeing happen, like seeing commercial media do before, that more folks are doing in a way that, like, they can actually demonstrate, that makes it worth, like, makes that investment worth it. Also, like, support from government support for news.
Yes.
News as a public good, like, that is another big thing that there's a lot of work to do there, but that's another big way that we can definitely get more funding support for news. So yeah, I think that there is a path for it, but it definitely starts with us reframing what journalism is, what news is, and I think that also connects to our shift in the practice of journalism, and also our repair of our relationship with communities. That is key, because if we can't show how communities are invested in the work that we do, we're not going to be able to get that buy-in from the folks we need to get that buy-in from to get the types of investments that we need to get to sustain this work.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually a perfect, especially the government infrastructure part, or the government support part. So next month, me and my colleague are actually going to Columbia University for the second of what is the hope of, like, mini meetings to kind of talk about what does government support actually look like for organizations, especially for helping them also stay independent of government influence as well. So we'll be meeting with folks from, like, Korea, from Australia, from Canada, who already have different laws or policies in place where they're using, like, either vouchers or, like, taxes or other ways of, like, government support to actually sustain the organizations there. But we're more so specifically looking at that from a reparations lens, and then also from a BIPOC media ecosystems lens as well. To give y'all a little bit of information about what we do at REJ is what we're essentially trying to build up a thriving BIPOC media ecosystem. So that goes all the way from, like, systems level all the way down to, like, what folks are actually doing on the ground. And so what we do is we provide support for capacity building on top of funding. So, like, how can we actually help this organization sustain itself on top of just, like, kind of throwing money at folks, which foundations and which philanthropy is good for. They just throw money at people without telling them or helping to guide them on how to use it, and then also helping them to build up the capacity to keep that money in place and to keep them making the money. We also do field building, where we actually grant folks for research and then also for helping us build out the field of what a thriving BIPOC media ecosystem looks like. So whether that be what are different engagement frameworks, what are different ways we can archive different histories that help to inform the future of journalism as well. And so when you're talking about, I don't know, when you're kind of talking about funding journalism specifically, I'm also thinking about the places like us, who are not like a Knight Foundation, who are not like a Democracy Fund, who are sitting upon millions and even more amounts of money. We're intermediary. We go raise the money and we go put it out. But what does it mean for a philanthropy group that's ran by BIPOC folks, for BIPOC folks, to be underfunded as well? The amount of folks, like the amount of grantees we get in who are saying, well, we need more. And we're like, we know. We are trying to get more. We need more as well. And I don't know, I think how hard it is to even fund a philanthropy fund that is specifically geared towards a disproportionately impacted group of journalists in itself is very telling of why it's so hard to even raise money for an individual organization too. So.
Just briefly, there's been some really cool new initiatives that have emerged in New Hampshire over the last 5 or so years. One is the Granite State News Collaborative, which the Keene Sentinel is a part of, and a lot of other state news organizations. And one thing that it's kind of a force multiplier, where if, you know, the Keene Sentinel happens to cover some news of statewide importance in Keene, it's a way for other outlets to kind of reach out and say, hey, can we also run that story, rather than having to have our own reporter go and follow up. It also facilitates outlets working together or partnering freelancers with these outlets to try and do more ambitious projects that then are shared statewide. So that's just kind of a cool example of different outlets trying to pool their resources for to do more.
I think that's also, I want to piggyback because this just reminded me why it's so important to give people the power of journalism, people the power of sharing information, just like Sierra said earlier about how it's so democratized. Like if we would actually report along, like, I don't know, I think about Louis Raven Wallace, who wrote The View from Somewhere, which is a really good book I think that you may be actually interested in. It's about the history of like objectivity and kind of like both sidesism. It's a really good one. I would love to talk to you about that if you ever get the chance. But I remember Louis just being like, I want a journalism so good where we don't have to exist anymore. I want to do journalism so well where the folks in the community can share the information amongst themselves and not have to depend on us to share the information in itself. And so, I'm just thinking about that around the funding question, and even how we can even be modeling different funding frameworks after justice-oriented groups and organizations like co-ops and all of that as well. So.
Great. Well, I know we are just about at time, so thank you all so much for coming, for listening to us. We're so grateful for your excellent questions. If you have questions, we'll be around for a little bit after the session. But other than that, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sierra, Paul, and Dalia. That was a fascinating conversation, very thought-provoking, and hopefully something that we can all take to heart and do better at. I do want to invite all of you folks to join us at Connect, which is an outdoor event. You should have a very pleasant evening. It's about 10 minutes heading south on Main Street. You'll see the tents, and I hope you'll join us. We've got some great local food, drink, music, and a chance to kind of continue the conversations that we started here today. And I look forward to seeing all of you folks here tomorrow for our third session, tomorrow at 2 o'clock, which we call Crazy Good, which are tips and tricks and techniques, the use of data and things of that nature to help all of us as journalists do a better job. So thanks for a very pleasant first day, and I hope you can all enjoy Connect. Thank you.